Hey everybody, welcome to CrazyTechLab, and we have some suitably crazy hardware in the lab today because we have Nvidia's brand new RTX 4090 graphics card. This one is the Founders Edition, of course, fresh from Nvidia, so thanks guys for sending this over for me to look at. And also in the lab today, something not quite as important, but maybe fairly important for your RTX 4090 build is a Thermaltake Tough Power GF3 1350 watt power supply for reasons that we will get to in a minute. So $1,600 worth of graphics card, which is ever so slightly insane. What's even, well, just as insane is how heavy this thing is and how large it is as well. It's absolutely monstrous. Triple slot, of course, and requiring a huge amount of power. Now, speaking about the power, what you have to deal with is one of these things. This is included in the box. It is a 4-way 8-pin splitter cable that goes in the graphics card on the side, and basically proving all of those rumors a few months ago wrong. You do not need to buy a new power supply in order to power this thing. You can use the splitter cable, but that's going to look pretty friggin' horrible in your build. What you can do though is opt for a power supply that offers the new PCI Express 5 standard cable, which will provide up to 600 watts over a cable like this, a single cable which goes into the side of the graphics card, and power supplies like the Tough Power GF3 will power this graphics card, the 4090, using just one single cable. Obviously, it'd be great to have something that's maybe a bit more like single strand braids or something like that, like a modified cable. But yeah, we'll have to wait for those to be available. But anyway, thanks for Thermaltake for sending out this power supply, which is what I've done all my testing with this week, and very, very quiet as well. And in terms of power consumption, well, we'll go into that a bit later on, but the system pushing around 600 watts under load. That's for the system, not just the graphics card. The graphics card was using a bit less than that. You're going to need a fairly beefy power supply, and that's without the CPU being under full load at the same time. So that's stuff that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. $1,500, $1,600 then when it's actually released. An absolute beast of a unit that we've got here. 24 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory and the new Ada Lovelace architecture as well. So monstrous, monstrous performance, as we will see later. In rasterization and DLSS, of course, performance that we'll be looking at across a bunch of games, including not just the standard DLSS that's available at the moment, but DLSS 3.0 as well. Now, this feature is super, super interesting because it can actually take performance or a load off your CPU and provide additional frames in those circumstances. So Flight Simulator, for example, I found it pretty difficult to get very, very high frame rates in that game, even with monstrous graphics cards and CPUs. There are other bottlenecks other than the GPU in that game, so that's going to be a particularly interesting one that you'll see later on, is the performance increase that you can see without DLSS, with DLSS 2.0 and with DLSS 3.0 in that game. The benefits you're seeing are absolutely amazing. DLSS 3.0 in Cyberpunk as well. So those two games, we're checking out the new version of DLSS, which isn't available yet, but Nvidia was kind enough to provide some beta samples of those games. They were fairly locked down, so I wasn't able to do the kind of cross graphics card manufacturer testing that I would like to have done, but we've still got some pretty useful numbers to seeing just how useful it's going to be. In pure rasterization and normal DLSS with ray tracing, etc., etc., we've got numerous titles, both new games that are pretty much hot off the press, and also some older ones, some old favorites as well, that we'll look at just to see what kind of performance you're going to be getting at very, very high resolutions with this monster graphics card. So lots to get through then, and lots more things to look at in future as well. We're going to be doing some builds with this graphics card, mini ITX, as well as ATX systems, just to see what kind of cases we can fit it in and if there are any issues cooling it, and lots more besides. So don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to turn on those notifications when so you'll be notified when we do upload a new video. And also don't forget to like and comment on this video as well. Liking just means that I get noticed and it pushes me up the YouTube algorithm. And comments, I obviously love getting comments from you guys, whether they're constructive criticism or whether you're complimenting me on my videos, or you're just letting me know what your system is at home, what you're thinking of building, and what you think of the product that I'm actually reviewing, or future product reviews that you want to do as well, because I cover all sorts of other stuff such as fans and cases and water cooling and all that kind of stuff. So don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Without that, I would like to give a final thanks to Nvidia for sending over the sample, and Thermaltake for sending over its super duper power supply to power the RTX 4090. And you can see links to all these items in the description below, as well as a whole bunch of other links to other videos you might be interested in. So let's crack on with some crazy benchmarks. Firstly, I thought it'd be useful to quickly go over the specifications so we know how the 4090 compares to the 3090 Ti and the 3090. So we're dealing with significantly higher boost frequencies for the GPU core, and in fact, while it says 2.52 gigahertz here, I regularly saw frequencies well above 2.7 gigahertz. So Nvidia being quite conservative when it comes to that frequency. The CUDA cores massively increased here, so up from 10,700 with the 3090 Ti to over 16,000 with the 4090. We've now got 512 tensor cores compared to just over 300 for the previous cards, and they are now 4th gen tensor cores. RT cores, we've got 128, a lot more than previous generation cards, and these again are 3rd gen as opposed to 2nd gen. RIPs, we've got 176 versus 112. The memory bus remains the same at 384-bit, as does the memory. We're still dealing with 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory. The L2 cache size, though, much larger than previous generations, and we are also looking at the same TDP to the 3090 Ti, but a significantly higher TDP than that of the RTX 3090. First up in our game test is Rainbow Six Extraction, and using the built-in benchmark at 1440p, the RTX 4090 was miles ahead of any other card on test, essentially nearly doubling the frame rates of the RTX 3090, miles ahead of the 3090 Ti, and also significantly faster than the RX 6950 XT, which managed a decent 99th percentile in this game compared to the older Nvidia cards. Dialing things up to 4K, and the situation was pretty much the same. Again, nearly double the frame rates of some of the slower cards on test, with the RX 6950 XT struggling a little here compared to the previous test where it came second. It's a distant last place here. And the RTX 3090, again, completely outdone by the 4090, and even the 3090 Ti was significantly much further behind, only just a little bit ahead of the RTX 3090. So a clear, resounding win for the RTX 4090 here. Rainbow Six Extraction again at 4K, but this time with DLSS enabled, and we're basically looking at going back to 1440p frame rates here. Obviously a massive improvement for the RTX 4090, pushing 300 frames a second on average, and again those are nearly double the numbers of the RTX 3090, which is obviously very impressive. Again, the RX 6950 XT lacking any kind of frame rate boosting here, but the RX 3090 Ti and 3090 just completely outdone by the RTX 4090 here. Next up is Forza Horizon 5, and at 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing enabled, the RTX 4090 was again a lot faster than the other graphics cards on test, but not quite as dominating as it was in Rainbow Six. So here the RX 6950 XT actually does pretty well considering ray tracing is enabled, beating out the RTX 3090 Ti and 3090. But the RTX 4090 offering significantly higher frame rates than both the older Nvidia cards. Stepping up to 4K again with ray tracing, and again it's a very clear lead by the RTX 4090, significantly outstripping all the other cards on both the 99th percentile and the average frame rate. Again though, not quite as dominating as it was in Rainbow Six, but significantly quicker than both the RTX 3090 Ti and RTX 3090, which struggled to hit 100 frames per second, whereas the RTX 4090 was well over 100 frames per second, even on the 99th percentile, hitting nearly 160 frames per second on the average. The next game test is Halo Infinite in the campaign mode, and the game at ultra settings and 4040p, the RTX 4090 managed over 200 frames per second on the average frame rate compared to 177 frames per second for the 3090 Ti and 176 for the 3090. So again, not quite as dominating here as in previous games for the RTX 4090, but it's a clear win nonetheless. Stepping things up to 4K now then, and the RTX 4090 extending its lead at this higher resolution with an average frame rate of 191 frames per second, which is getting on for double that of the other cards on test. In fact, it is more than double the RX 6950 XT's average frame rate of 95 frames per second, and even the 99th percentile was significantly faster than the other two Nvidia cards. So the RTX 4090 showing its worth at higher resolutions. Moving on to an old favourite now, and it's Metro Exodus, the enhanced edition with ray tracing enabled, and here with DLSS and Hairworks disabled, the RTX 4090 at 1440p managed some significantly higher frame rates than all the other cards on test. In fact, both of them, the 99th percentile and average frame rates, are close to double, and in fact more than double the other frame rates from the other cards. For example, the 6950 XT's average frame rate was just 56 frames per second. That the 4090 more than double that at 114 frames per second, which is very, very impressive. The RTX 4090's minimum 99th percentile of 72 frames per second was getting on for double that of the 6950 XT and 3090. But the RTX 3090 Ti offering slightly higher frame rates than the 3090. But again, it's a clear win and pretty dominating performance from the RTX 4090. Stepping up to 4K now then in Metro Exodus, and it's another dominant display by the RTX 4090 with its average frame rate of nearly 90 frames per second, more than double that of every other card on test. The 99th percentile frame rate though isn't quite as impressive, but still double that of the 6950 XT, nearly double that, nearly double that of the RTX 3090. And a good 23 frames per second more than the RTX 3090 Ti as well. So it's another dominant display by the 4090 in this test. Now at 4K with ray tracing enabled, but DLSS enabled this time as well in its balanced mode, the RTX 4090 again with a commanding lead over every other graphics card in the test, nearly double the average frame rate of the RTX 3090. Significantly higher than the RTX 3090 Ti as well on both the 99th percentile and average frame rate, and obviously much faster than the 6950 XT, because obviously that doesn't support DLSS in this game, but a very dominating performance by the 4090 yet again. To Watch Dogs Legion now then, and at 4040p with DXR ray tracing enabled, the RTX 4090 again with a very significant lead over the 3090 Ti. 100 frames per second on the average at the settings compared to 65 frames for the 3090 Ti, 64 frames for the 3090 and 51 frames for the 6950 XT. Dialing things up to 4K at those same settings then, and again the RTX 4090 way out in front of the other cards. In fact, it was nearly double the performance of the RTX 3090 on the average frame rate, and not far off that also on the minimum 99th percentile as well. Not much difference between the 3090 Ti and 3090 here, so it's pretty much the same conclusion against the 3090 Ti as well, but obviously very, very high frame rates from this very, very powerful and expensive graphics card. At 4K again, but with DLSS in balance mode enabled now then, and we've got another very dominating performance by the RTX 4090, which managed an average frame rate of 100 frames per second, minimum 99th percentile of 79 frames per second, so we're kind of getting back very similar to 1440p frame rates here. The RTX 3090 Ti managing an average of 68 frames per second, again that's significantly less than the RTX 4090, and of course the RTX 6950 XT here, just kind of stuck in this graph, but obviously with no DLSS working on that card. So it's another dominating performance by the RTX 4090. Moving on to Far Cry now then, and at ultra settings with 1440p resolution, the RTX 4090 not really offering that much more over and above the next best card, which was the RX 6950 XT. Average frame rate of 154 frames per second versus 146. Not the kind of improvement you want to see from spending that much extra money. The minimum 99th percentile, a little more impressive. Gaining 25% over the 6950 XT and a little more than that over the 3090 Ti and 3090. Stepping up to 4K, and there was a little more difference here. So the RTX 4090 managing an average frame rate of 138 frames per second versus the 94 frames per second of the 6950 XT, and again similar results for the lower three cards on test in this game, and the RTX 4090 clearly dominating the field here with slightly more of an advantage than at 1440p. Sticking with Far Cry for a moment, at 4K and with DXR reflections enabled this time, and the RTX 4090 again with a significant lead over every other card on test. The RX 6950 XT having a bit of an advantage over the other Nvidia cards as well, but it's still much, much slower than the RTX 4090, trailing 24 frames per second on the 99th percentile, and significantly behind the average frame rate as well. So again, you maybe want to see more than this for the price that you're paying for the 4090, but there is a significant lead here in this game nonetheless. Flight Simulator is a tricky game to run at high frame rates for the simple reason that there seems to be bottlenecks in other parts of the system, and that was very evident at 1440p, which is kind of where you would start to see CPU bottlenecking in any game that has an element of CPU bottlenecking. Obviously dipping down to 1080p would be even worse, but here there's very, very little difference between the cards, and you certainly wouldn't want to buy the RTX 4090 if you're just sticking to normal rasterization, but as we'll see in a minute, DLSS 3 can help. And here, that CPU bottleneck starts to become slightly less of an issue, as you'd expect, with the RTX 4090 starting to edge out a lead, but it's in no way, any way, shape or form worth the extra price that you'll be paying over the RTX 3090 Ti, for example. Finally then, at 4K in Flight Simulator, but with DLSS enabled this time, and we're looking at pretty similar frame rates for a lot of the cards on test, but here DLSS allows the other Nvidia cards to kind of step up and match the RTX 4090, because you're simply not having enough stuff to deal with, basically, because there are bottlenecks elsewhere in the system with this game. So hopefully in a minute we'll see what impact DLSS 3 can have on Microsoft Flight Simulator. So here we are with the beta version of Microsoft Flight Simulator provided by Nvidia. So this was fairly locked down, which meant that I couldn't actually use my usual benchmark, which I tested all the graphics cards on prior to getting my hands on this, which was a bit of a pain. But hopefully we can look at this again in future. But even so, you can see the difference here with the RTX 4090 struggling to get much above 80 frames per second on the average. And slightly different benchmark to the one that I use with lower frame rates, but that's why the results aren't comparable, because it's a very, very different benchmark in a very different scene. But the RTX 4090 with DLSS 3 enabled, essentially doubling those frame rates or very close to it. So some significant gains here for DLSS 3 in Flight Simulator, and it's one of those games that will benefit massively for it because it is bound by other aspects of your PC, probably the processor or something else, and it's not generally limited by the GPU. So the fact that DLSS 3 can actually boost frame rates irrespective of the GPU pipeline and of CPU throttling and that kind of stuff means that you're basically going to be guaranteed a significant frame rate boost, which is really, really good if you like those landings and takeoffs to be super smooth. Finally, looking at Cyberpunk 2077, which is a new game that I'll be adding to my benchmarks, and here the beta version of the game at 4K, high settings, ray tracing, and we have DLSS 3 enabled. Absolutely monstrous frame rates in this game. 122 frames per second on the 99th percentile, 141 on the average. Pretty much double the RTX 4090, even with DLSS 2 enabled. And compared to DLSS being disabled, no DLSS involved at all, just night and day, really. You're looking at 4 times increase over those non-DLSS numbers down the bottom, which pretty much tallies with what Nvidia has been telling us, really. So DLSS 3, very, very exciting. Not going to be available in every game at launch, but I think there are 30 odd titles that will be available very, very soon. Obviously, Flight Simulator and Cyberpunk can be 2 titles that people will want to see some higher frame rates in. Still very, very good image quality. I couldn't really tell much difference in either Cyberpunk or Flight Simulator, so there will obviously be a lot more testing around this in the weeks to come. Our final test is power consumption, and despite the rumours, you probably won't need to buy a new PSU, at least if you have something of 850 watts or more. The RTX 4090 actually drew less than the Palette GameRock RTX 3090 Ti that I had, which drew well over 600 watts, but the RTX 4090 drawing 591 watts, and this is for the system as a whole, not the actual board power. The RX 6950 XT hit 571 watts, and the RTX 3090 hit 545. A quick word on frequencies, temperatures, and board power and all that kind of stuff. So I saw a peak frequency of 2.745 gigahertz, 2745 megahertz, which is actually a fair bit higher than what Nvidia stated for the RTX 4090. The memory clock peaked at 1300 megahertz, GPU temperature 66 degrees, and hotspot 77 degrees. So both of those pretty reasonable. The card also stayed fairly quiet as well. Both fans not topping 1400 RPM, but you kind of hope that it would be quiet given the size of the cooler. Finally, the board power peaked at 441 watts. So what do we make of the Nvidia GeForce RTX 4090 then? Well, it's a monstrous graphics card in terms of its size, performance and price, and I don't think we were really expecting anything different to that. We knew how much it was going to cost, which is $1,600. That's a huge amount for any kind of graphics card. But when you're considering that you're getting this absolute monster of a unit, you know, you get it out the box, it does feel like it's worth that much money. In terms of gaming, I mean, when you're chugging along with an RTX 3090 and you're pushing out some pretty decent frame rates at 4K in Rainbow Six, for example, and then all of a sudden this comes along and nearly doubles that frame rate, and that's without DLSS or DLSS 3. That's pretty impressive. It's like that across the board as well. You're getting significantly higher frame rates in pretty much every single situation. There are some situations where it doesn't offer significantly higher frame rates, and that is largely, for the most part, down to other bottlenecks in the system. For example, Flight Simulator just seems to be stubbornly stuck at lower frame rates due to other reasons. But again, that's something that DLSS 3 will likely help with if you are concerned about, improving your frame rates in that game. And for me, Flight Simulator, I'm a diehard fan of Flight Simulator. I do a bit of flying myself, and that kind of stuff is very important. Having a smooth frame rate, especially in those situations when you're coming to land or taking off and that kind of stuff, you want higher frame rates, possibly over visual performance. But when it comes to visual performance and image quality, what we're seeing, or certainly what I've seen, is something that is pretty much on par with standard rasterization, without DLSS at all. And Nvidia continues to make strides there, unless you're really, picking holes in terms of the image quality. So DLSS 3, though, as we've mentioned, is still in its early stages. We've only had access to very, very limited locked down beta versions of games at the moment. So, for example, Cyberpunk, I couldn't play that with any other graphics cards that I've currently got. So the comparison there was only between no DLSS, DLSS 2 and DLSS 3. So you can kind of see what impact it has, but you can't see just how fast it is compared to other graphics cards. And also with Flight Simulator, unfortunately, the beta version was so locked down that I couldn't open up the usual flight plans and stuff that I use for my own benchmark. So I couldn't get any numbers compared to other graphics cards, and that's kind of annoying, because I wanted to try and increase those frame rates in a benchmark that I know is pretty tough, but I couldn't do that with the beta version because it was locked down. So that's something I'll be really, really keen to test, and I'll be back with a future video just seeing what it can do with DLSS 3.0 when that is finally released in a public version of Flight Simulator. So that's going to be super, super interesting to see what happens there. Elsewhere, as I've mentioned, we have an absolutely monstrous graphics card offering monstrous performance. Its size is going to be an issue in a lot of cases. There are going to be a lot of cases out there, especially mini ITX systems, that won't be able to fit it because it's so large. Obviously, water cooling it is going to be one option to squeeze it into smaller spaces, but I will be looking at mini ITX options for this case, or mini ITX case options for this card, should I say, in a future video. So obviously, we're not talking about value here. We never were going to be. It's a monstrous graphics card at a monstrous price, as I've mentioned. For those of you who do have large enough wallets for it, this is currently the most powerful graphics card by far out there, and it has plenty more performance in store when it comes to DLSS as well. Today, though, I would like to thank Thermaltake for sending over its Tough Power GF3 PSU, which allows you to swap the dreaded 4-way 8-pin connector for a single PCI Express 5 connector. So definitely I would recommend doing that if you're in the market for one of Nvidia's new graphics cards, the 4090 or any of the other ones. Just super, super handy and much, much cleaner for your system. And you can see links to all the hardware that I've covered today in the description below. I'd also, of course, like to thank Nvidia for sending over the sample of the Founders Edition, because without that, I couldn't have done today's review. So that's it. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will speak to you soon. See ya.